like to think about the heart factor. If my heart quits right now, everything else quits. I lose vision, I lose hearing, I lose every sense that my body physically has. And it all comes to the heart. And then, of course, the brain is affected and everything else. So when I think about the health of the church, I think, okay, what is the heart of the church? When you get beyond the natural answers to that, our love for Christ, prayer, all of those things, I think the heart of the church that gives us the greatest indication of how we're doing always comes back to mission and vision. When I go see a doctor, the first thing they do is check my pulse and blood pressure. Those are always the first things they do. Well, let me take that back. My doctor always checks my weight. I go in, he puts scale, then we go to blood pressure and pulse.
That's right.
So when I think of blood pressure and pulse, I think of mission and vision. So regardless of the size of a congregation, regardless of the size of a movement, how is that movement projecting its mission and vision? How is it accomplishing its mission and
Hey, thank you so much for tuning in. This is going to be an exciting episode. I was able to host the General Overseer of the Church of God, Bishop Tim Hill. He came on to talk about what church health is, to talk about his experience as a pastor, what he saw, and is now General Overseer. What does he think a healthy church is? And looking forward, what can we do as a movement to establish that church plant, church revitalization, evangelism, relaunch, all of these different things that help us to stay healthy into the future. How can we secure that? And what's that going to look like? How can we make sure that's going to happen? I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Please, if you don't mind, like and subscribe to the channel. That helps us get this word out to more people. It really helps us out. So we're doing this to help make us all better leaders. So do me a favor and press that button. And with that said, let's go to the interview now with Bishop Tim Hill. Hey, Bishop Hill, thank you so much for being willing to come on the podcast today. It's very exciting for me to be able to interview and talk to you about this. It's an exciting time in the Church of God. A lot of great things happening, a lot of good conversations about what we like to talk about here with revitalization and church planting and church health in general and evangelism. So thank you so much for coming on today, being willing to talk about this.
Thank you, Pastor Will. It's great to be with you and happy to be with everybody that's watching today.
Awesome. Normally I go into a long introduction and tell everybody about who my guest is, but you are probably the one that's been on that everybody knows the most. You are out front, the General Overseer of our movement. We're very thankful that all you have done. We see you preaching all over the place. And so that's really awesome that everybody does know you. If anybody outside of our movement doesn't know who you are, just a quick Google search and they will see, where you've been preaching or get on YouTube. And so you have had an incredible platform in your time there, and you've done a lot with it. And so thank you for all that.
Honored to be with you. Thank you.
So if we get right into the topic, what we like to talk about here is church health.
Yeah.
And I love to get everybody's perspective, and yours is going to be such a unique one. You've got to see it on the church level. You've got to see it as a traveling evangelist level. You've got to see it from world missions level, and now at the highest office in the Church of God, where you get to see it in our whole movement. So if you don't mind, explain a little bit, what do you see if we were in a perfect world and everything was going right? What would that healthy church look like? What are some of the key aspects that you see? Hey, that church is really doing good beyond numbers, beyond tithes. What are those things that you see as a really healthy church?
Great question, Will. For me, I typically work with analogies and comparisons with other things that just kind of help me explain, the bottom line of what I'm trying to say. And one of the analogies that I use as it relates to the church is an analogy that's really used throughout Scripture, and that is the body of Christ. We hear a lot about the body when we read the Scripture. Paul talked a lot about the body. And with that as an analogy, I like to think about the heart factor. If my heart quits right now, everything else quits. I lose vision, I lose hearing, I lose every sense that my body physically has, and it all comes to the heart, and then, of course, the brain is affected and everything else. So when I think about the health of the church, I think, okay, what is the heart of the church? When you get beyond the natural answers to that, our love for Christ, prayer, all of those things. I think the heart of the church that gives us the greatest indication of how we're doing always comes back to mission and vision.
Mhm.
When I go see a doctor, the first thing they do is check my pulse and blood pressure. Those are always the first things they do. Well, let me take that back. My doctor always checks my weight. I go in, he puts my scale, then we go to blood pressure and
That's
pulse.
right.
So when I think of blood pressure and pulse, I think of mission and vision. So regardless of the size of a congregation, regardless of the size of a movement, how is that movement projecting its mission and vision? How is it accomplishing its mission and vision? Because to be honest with you, there's a lot of small churches out there that we refer to as small churches. Let's just say under 50 or under 80, but their mission and vision is very active. It's very healthy. It's very strong, and they're doing great ministry in their community. For an example, I was just at my home church where I graduated high school about a month ago. Hadn't been back in a long time. That church, probably on a good day, runs about 85, 90 people. For the size of the community, it's a very, very good church, very healthy church. But they have put out more pastors. They have supported more missionaries. They've got, of course, a general overseer on their list of history. They've got two or three state overseers on their list of history, and it all goes back to the mission and vision of that church to do the Great Commission in their setting and in their context. So that's just my take on it. I think if the mission and vision of the church is being done to fulfill the will of God for their community in the context of where they are, then that is probably one of the greatest signs of a healthy church. And then, of course, you can go down all kinds of tributaries with that.
Mhm.
Uh, Money and dollars follow ministry. You could talk about that. You could talk about discipleship. You could talk about, your various departments, youth, different kinds of departments, ministry, but it all flows out of the heart of the church. And if that heart is healthy, if that mission and vision is healthy, then I think the church is going to experience overall health long term.
And I love how you brought out that that's not size of the church related.
Oh,
It's you may be doing less, but if you look at it, I like to look at things on a percentage basis.
yeah,
Even with the baptisms and salvations, on a smaller church, if the pastor may say, "Hey, I've only baptized 2 people this year." Well, you know what? That's a pretty good percentage on a small church. You know what I'm saying? If you can keep
that,
that rolling and keep that growing,
yeah.
it's not always what we have to do as small church. I'm in a small church pastor now myself. I'm not going to have the same numbers as a church that's running 500 to 1,000, but that doesn't mean I can't be effective.
There you
Uh,
go. And it all comes to context. Where are you? What
mhm.
population of where you are? What is the church overall church experience of your community? Are there a lot of this denomination, a lot of that denomination? Are you like a little David among a bunch of giants?
Right.
So I think it just comes to context as well.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. I love the heart analogy. We've got to keep that going. I've had my own spell here lately where I've had to get in touch with my heart lately. I had a little bit of an out of rhythm experience, and so I get that throws everything out of whack. And
Well,
so we
great. To me that is a good analogy to just keep hitting on for a minute because when the heart is affected, if the heart gets out of rhythm, then there's a reason for that. What's going on neurologically? What's going on maybe with weight? What's going on with blood pressure? All what's going on with all these symptomatic things that flow back into the heart that could affect and even destroy the body. So the heart out of the heart, the Bible said, flow the issues of life. So there you go.
that's the truth. Because mine, man, you look at it physiology. You got the anxiety, you got the stress, you got the pressure, and I can see a lot of that in a church. That when that core is not right, you're going to
Mhm.
see all those symptoms. And
Yeah.
so we're busy trying to treat symptoms of church health when out. Sometimes we need to get to the core of that. So no, I love that. What do you, I mean, how do we look at that? How do we evaluate those things? If you know what I'm saying, a lot of it's going to take a lot of honesty from the top down, looking inside of our church. Hey, what am I preaching? What am I teaching? What are some keys to kind of get back on track with that?
Well, yeah, again, we just stay on this analogy for a while. I think there are things that we do. And first of all, we have to be diagnosed. When something's going on, we've got to be willing to be diagnosed. One of the dangers with any of us is self-diagnosis.
Hmm.
I may wake up one morning and tell my wife Paula, I'm not feeling well. I've got a headache or whatever, feeling a little tension here and there. So, let me take an Advil, let me take a Tylenol, when what I may need is there may be an infection somewhere that requires an antibiotic. And so if I lean only to self-diagnosis, then I'm hindering and prolonging the pain or prolonging the agony. And so that's why we have doctors. We go to a doctor's office and he runs us through whatever tests we may need. And the outside eyes, the outside ears, the outside process of helping us find the real problem is important. So what I've made a practice of in my ministry as a pastor was continual consultation. Of course, it's been a long time since I pastored a church, but I think the principles are the same. Every now and then,
Hmm.
you've got a set of eyes looking at your situation, and that was always helpful. So diagnosis is always a key. And then once you get the diagnosis, then you've got to be willing to enter into the discipline. Am I disciplined enough to follow doctor's orders? What am I doing with my structure in the church? What's not working here? What worked, this is an old thing, but what worked in 1990 is not going to work in 2024. And so I've got to be willing to discipline myself to try new things, or never discard the message, but discard the method sometimes.
Hmm.
Uh, just doesn't work here anymore. So diagnosis, discipline, and then I could go on down with all the D words. But I think one of the most important components of it all is, am I willing to employ and dive into some of the diagnostic issues that I may be alerted to. And so, from a general church setting, I can only speak to that from my most recent experience. The executive committee continually is looking at consultation that we've received from, I know years ago we used heavily the John Maxwell Group, pretty
Hmm.
well in these early 2000s. More recently, we've leaned on guys like Sam Chand. Uh, Even Mark Rutland has been a great resource for me. And Mark's at an age in his life, but he's still very cutting edge. And so many others that names fail me right now. But the executive committee is always allowing for other eyes to look at our structure.
Hmm.
We have meetings. We spend a lot of time talking about those kind of things. So it's different for different people, but that's very important to me.
And one thing we discussed a little bit before we went live is as pastors we do that evaluation, but sometimes it's hard to get the people we're leading on board with that. In my congregation, I see these changes that we need to make, and that's why I tell everybody that's the whole point of when the podcast came out. I've been through a lot in the 5 years revitalizing the church. There's been a lot of struggles there. I've learned a lot of things, made a lot of mistakes. Is the preparation to how hard that can be sometimes. Of sharing that message and doing it in a right way so you don't offend people. You're not saying the walls are falling down, but we need to do some things.
Well, it comes
Uh,
it comes to leadership, and an effective leader is going to involve a lot of different eyes, a lot of different voices, a lot of different hearts in the situation. I just came through an exercise with seminary. I'm finishing a master's degree with them here in just a few days, and one of
Congratulations.
the exercises that I did is what is known as the appreciative inquiry
Hmm.
exercise. And as I got into it, I realized I've been doing that all my ministry and didn't know that's what it was.
Hmm.
But basically, what it boils down to is you bring the team around you and you ask the right questions. And sometimes you got to search for the right questions, because sometimes the immediate questions are not the right questions. But when you finally land on what the right questions are, then in an appreciative inquiry process, it's a team effort. And from that, you can go somewhere. And so That's been very important to me all my ministry. I just didn't know what I should have called it, but that's exactly what I've been doing. A good leader is never afraid to bring other leaders around him,
Right.
and you identify who those people are, and you bring them in because they're people of influence. And if you can get them on board, then they're going to get their folks on board, and it just makes for a lot healthier situation and a good and happier situation.
Right. And so let's talk about it a little bit. We talk about the sense of urgency and that self-diagnosis. One thing that's come up in the Church of God and our movement is the potential to bring a new position on board, or I'm calling it a new position because I don't remember as much about the old position. I wasn't as involved then. And I know the structure sounds completely different from what it was. There's some things that we're borrowing from the past, but we're moving forward in a different direction. If you don't mind, talk a little bit about, so the evaluation process, about why is that important? You know what I'm saying? Where are we at in the road now of why we say, hey,
Yeah,
we really need to bring that focus to a revitalization, especially an elected position, something that has that weight behind it, as we've heard. So what does the evaluation look like? And then what is that position? What are we hoping for that to look like?
good. Well, first of all, let me address that to a younger generation. This is a new position
Right.
because this what we used to have is evangelism and home missions, and that's what you're referring to.
Hmm.
What we used to have technically fell off the table in 2012. It was voted out by the assembly in 2010 and phased out over 2 years. And so since 2012, so 12 years now, we've not had an evangelism and home missions department in the church. And so to everybody that's got on board since 2012, this is a new concept. It's a new department opportunity. A lot to talk about there, Will. First of all, let me begin with what it was, and then we're going to talk about what it needs to be.
Hmm.
Back in the days, let me go back into the mid to late 60s. Evangelism and home missions came as a department. It was elected, or it was voted on, determined to be a department by the General Assembly back in those days, with one director. You didn't have an assistant director at first. It was one director, and an assistant director came on later. But initially, evangelism and home mission, you just put everything under that umbrella that had to do with church growth, revival, church health, and then out of that began to grow some other ministries. Evangelism and home mission was the mother department. It was the mother concept of what became men and women of action, people for care and learning, lay ministries with Leonard Albert in years to come, jail and prison ministries, women in ministry. It was like it was a creative force, just a creative engine for so many initial ministries that were birthed in the late 60s, into the 70s, even into the 80s. And what happened is those ministries that were birthed under evangelism and home mission and for a long time were under that umbrella, they began to take a life of their own. The children began to mature. They grew up, became adults, and set out on their own trajectory and their own path to be a full-time department or a full-time ministry. And
Hmm.
so as that happened, I use the word proliferated. They were proliferated away or cut away from the mother, from the main department. And so now you've got Men and Women of Action. It's its own entity. It's its own 501c3. You've got People for Care and Learning. It's its own
Hmm.
501c3. You've got Operation Compassion was another one. And so on and on. All of these children of evangelism and home missions grew up, matured, went on their own. So by the time it was eliminated, it had come down from about, I don't know, probably close to 20 different entities that it gave oversight to, down to maybe five or six. By the time it was eliminated, it was giving oversight to the Senior Adult Convention, which we still have, jail and prison ministry, women in ministry, not to be confused with women's ministry department, but women credentialed ministers,
Hmm.
Southwest Indian ministry, and then of course the overriding thing over it all was its overall purpose for existence: church planting and revitalization. Sounded good, but the problem with that was there was no budget money to do that with. I remember some very frustrating meetings with the executive committee in my first run, with the budget review committee, when the director and the assistant director of evangelism, great men who had been effective everywhere they had been, but now they sat at the table with the budget review committee, almost with their hat in their hand, pleading for just a little bit of increase every year. But they would walk out the door and didn't have enough money to even pay the salaries of the directors or a secretary.
Mm.
Uh, the old analogy back in those days before electronic media took off, they couldn't even buy a ream of paper or a pencil without going in the red. And so here they are tasked with doing church planning. We didn't really talk too much about revitalization back in those days. It was mostly all church planning, but they
Mhm.
were getting a task that was enormous with no money to do it with. And so finally, when 2008 came along at the General Assembly, and there was the decision to do a tithe reduction that took effect in 2009. As that began to play out, monies were less and less for appropriations to departments. And I'll never forget the speech that was made in 2010. And I won't call the name of the brother, very well respected in the church. He was on the Council of 18 at the time. I'll never forget his speech that finally sealed the deal. He
Mhm.
said, quote, "Men, we're broke."
Right. Right. It doesn't get any plainer than that.
Yeah, he said that in the context of this discussion. This is what we were discussing. And there was some back and forth about why we should do it, why we should. But when he said, "Men, we're broke," that was it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
uh, the decision was made. And then the hardship became, how do you phase that out? Because you've got two elected men. You don't
Mhm.
want to just let them go on the spot. So we gave them 2 years to phase it out. And that was probably the hardest 2 years up until more recent years that I had ever faced, because I was a liaison to that department. And here I am with elected leaders who know their time is up at the 2012 assembly, and we've got to recreate whatever we're going to, create. So, in a nutshell, it had just dwindled down to a very ineffective force with no money to fund it. Now, here's the heartbreak. The heartbreak for me, and I think for this denomination, became we were and are a major Pentecostal voice in the Pentecostal evangelical world. And yet, for the last 12 years, we have not been able to say we have an evangelism arm.
Mhm.
The assumption was when we did this that everybody does evangelism anyway. In their own way, it flows out of every department. Theoretically, yes, and that sounds good.
Right.
But for 12 years, we have not had an intentional arm of this church that says or does evangelism and home missions as their only priority. I mean, you've got youth and discipleship. Sure, they do their version of evangelism. You've got adult discipleship. Absolutely. They do their version of evangelism. You've got Hispanic ministries. Sure. But for 12 years, we have not had a arm of evangelism whose only priority was church planning, church health and revitalization, and the training and everything that flows out of that. So, what do? First of all, we don't want to go back to what we had.
Mhm.
What we had was not working. When it was all said and done, or if it was working, we would have never disposed of it. So we want to go back with a different model. We want to go back with a new model. Now, I will admit to you that the model is not perfected yet, and I don't think it will be until we open it up and get it going, and you get your leaders in here and they start working with it. But I do think initially we can go in with a platform of vision and mission, saying this is what we want it to be. And now, how that takes legs after the assembly is over and we get back to our offices and start really working with it, then that's another story. But I do think we've got to go in saying, here are our priorities. We want to revitalize churches. We want healthy, growing churches that are pastored by healthy, growing pastors. And then church planning has got to become and I'll say this, I'll stick my neck out on this. I think it's got to become the priority.
Hmm.
I think revitalization certainly is huge, but if we don't start planting churches, we are on a slow path for eventual demise.
Right.
Uh, we have gone from the 90s to planning probably 350 churches a year. Our peak, I think, was 95, and we planted around 350 churches that year.
Hmm.
And the target goal is always to do 3% of what you already have. But we hadn't hit that in a long time. Since COVID, I'm sorry to say this has happened even on my watch, but since COVID, our church planning organization numbers, let me put it that way, the organizing of churches has come down to somewhere between 50 and 60. Now, we plan a lot of churches. When Mitch Maloney was over church planning from 2016 until 2022, when he transitioned, there were probably about 1,000 church plants. The problem with that was we had failed in getting them all the way around the ball diamond. I mean,
Hmm.
they bat the ball at home plate and then go to first, second, third base, but we have not effectively got them to home plate. So that doesn't feed into the structure, that doesn't feed into the organization. And we spent a lot of money. We have spent a boatload of money helping church planners with the new church planning bank get started with minimal loans. I think the minimum loan was 15 to 20,000. The maximum loan was 50,000. So we did that. We've still got money in the bank to do some more of that. The problem has been we have not been able to effectively get them to an organizational standpoint so that they begin to become part of the vibrancy of the church, the mission, discipleship of the church, and, to be bluntly honest, the financial flow of the church, because that's our bread and butter, is
Hmm.
to plant churches who, at the end of the day, they're part of the financial flow of the church. Yes, they're doing ministry, but the tithe of tithe is what keeps this baby going.
Hmm.
And so we have really failed. I'll just admit it. We have failed in that area. I think we've got legitimate excuses, but
Hmm.
at the end of the day, they're still excuses. And so that's to me the grunt work, that whoever's elected to do this, if the assembly votes to do it, whoever's elected, they got a big job on their hands to come in and quickly turn that around. And so church planning, to me, in my mind, is going to be number one. I think co-equal with that. I won't even make it number two, but I'll say co-equal with that and in tandem with that is church revitalization.
Hmm.
Because again, we use COVID as our forever excuse, but since COVID, we've got a lot of churches on life support right now,
Hmm.
and uh, we've got to get them on a healthy path again. So, whoever these brothers are going to be that that do this job, the work's cut out for them.
Yeah. Hey, and so you brought out a lot of stuff there. If I can back up on a few things, I had a few questions coming into this. And I know, like you said, we're bringing this up. So one of my worries is from a revitalization guy standpoint, and I love church planting, revitalization, replant, and evangelism. You mentioned your master's. Congratulations on that. I graduate in 3 weeks with mine. I have a master's in church planting.
Cool.
Start the PhD in revitalization. So that's my heart. You know what I'm saying? That's where I'm at. And when I look at this, my worry is, um, and I've heard that it'll be tightened up, but so we talked about what the evangelism department was, and it's a new concept. How do we put some guardrails around that? Are we leaving that up to the when we vote on it? Because my thoughts are, like you. Let's back up a second. You said mission and vision are our number one thing. You know what I'm saying? That's mission and vision of the church, of the movement, and everything. So, how do we, as a body, if we're going to start this department, say, okay, we're electing this, but as a body, this is our mission and vision. We want who we elect.
Yeah.
This is what we want you to do. Or are we leaving it up to hiring them, basically hiring, you know what I'm saying? And saying, all right, now what do you want us to do? So
Yeah.
how do we set those guardrails around? Because if you start a department that their main focus is starting new ministries, they're going to start new ministries. You know what I'm saying? That's just who they are if you put them in there. So how do we set some guardrails around it as a body? Do we say, all right, your focus from now on is evangelism, replant, plant, and revitalize. That's
Yeah,
it.
great question. I think when you get the agenda, look at the job description because it's going to be there.
Okay.
The executive council approved it 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
So all of this will be coming forth in just a matter of days. So look at it. It's not perfected. That's why we have a general council and general assembly to
Hmm.
edit, to amend, to add, to take away, whatever. So look at the job description when it comes. I think you're going to find that it's pretty complete. I think there's room for adjustment. I think the other thing I would say is don't put in there what's going to encumber this department.
Hmm.
Let's make the main thing the main thing.
Right.
Let's focus on what it needs to be. Don't. I'm going to be blunt. I'm going to be blunt here because what have I got to lose?
Oh no, hey, that's why. Look, neither one of us want this job. You
Yeah,
know what I'm saying? And we talked about this in advance, so we can talk about it in a different
yeah,
way. So
yeah.
that's what we want here.
Blunt. My blunt statement is don't make it a catch-all.
Right.
Other things that other departments don't want to do or can't do or wouldn't be effective in doing. Don't just let it be a box that you pitch other ideas into that encumber and take away from the main mission of this thing. And then there's no money there to do those things with, because what happens, those things become the focal point if you're not careful, and you lose focus on what really needs to happen. Now, let me just say this, and I wrote it in an article recently. This has not been a personnel problem.
Right.
I will admit, every now and then, because of our electoral system, you may get someone who's not as gifted in an area as someone else would be. We all get that. But this has not primarily been a personnel problem. I mean, you've got men that have had this job before that were hugely effective as state overseers or as pastors or whatever. And then we put them in something that's got so many limitations on it,
Hmm.
that they were hamstrung, their hands were tied. So I think going in, the council, the general council, and this is going to be one of the top issues on the agenda. The council has got to dig deep into this. Don't let get on that list of job descriptions stuff that don't need to be there. And
Right.
when you get into and you see some things that you already see a red flag, somebody needs to go to the floor and say, "Hey, let's don't encumber this department with this item. This is more of a, I won't name the department, but this fits better somewhere else."
Hmm.
Here's the other thing, and I'm gonna cause heart tremors right here. Uh, my other brothers on the committee might not like this, but one of the first things I'd do, I'd take the term limitation off this thing. Uh, and I'm going to say that knowing that probably cannot be done because we're trying to be congruent with the other departments, world missions committee, et cetera, youth. So you've got a 4-year term limit. I get that. But if you find the right guy and he gets in here and does a bang up job, why in this world are we going to yank his teeth out in 4 years and say thanks, but no thanks? Let's move on. I get tenure limitation. I live by that, lived by it for a long time, and it has its place, and it's a protective guardrail. I get that, but in this kind of deal, why are we going to limit a man on his tenure? Now, I'm going to open a big can of worms here because we don't really want to go here, and I'm going to tell you why. That could lend to the discussion of, okay, does he need to be elected or can he be appointed? If he's appointed, then you take away the tenure deal. Well, the give and take of that is we've had appointed men for the last several years, but there's something about an elected individual going into a position.
Hmm.
I don't want to overstate it, but it's there. It's just there. When a man is elected to do something, then somehow there is a general acceptance of the body that this man was seen as an individual who has the know-how to get this done, or he wouldn't have been there. Now, there are times it's politicized. We all know how it works. But overall, I think there's something to be said from the general body when they say, aha, wait a minute. The church as a whole saw something in this brother that qualifies him to be here. So there's just something about an elected individual when he goes from state to state or even in other countries, uh, that has a credence to it. That
Hmm.
that that has a credence to it that people set up and pay attention. Whereas if he's elected or not elected, but if he's appointed by five men in a committee room, as important as that sounds and as important as it really is, the overall body may say, well, that was just their opinion.
Hmm.
Five men made that decision based on their opinion or what they knew. But this man was elected by, a couple of thousand leaders sitting on the floor that saw something in him that says he's got the know how and the credentials to make this work. So, from that standpoint, my meter goes in that direction. I,
Hmm.
I, I believe the elected part of this is important enough to stay on that track. The downside of it is, for me personally, is if you get a man that can really do the job, it's unfortunate that in 4 years, we'll move him out. So you just have to leave those things with the Lord and trust it'll all be all right. But bottom line, I think it's needed. I think we need to go back to this or create what we want it to be. I just hate that as a denomination, we're not able to say we have an intentional arm of evangelism for the Church of God.
Right. Yeah, and I like to, I'm all for you on the extending it, maybe not indefinitely,
Yeah,
but there's been different conversations, and I've even heard people say the assistant is going to have the better impact because hopefully if they're there 4 years, they have a chance of getting reelected, so they get 8 years in that term.
they're like,
So you almost want to look at uh, whoever starts this will never really get to enjoy the fruit of it moving forward and get the full benefit
oh,
of that because it's going to take some time. I know.
everything has
Yeah,
its good. You just it's just the way it is.
it is. And also I'll ask you a question on this and so no disrespect to anybody who's held these positions. This is just something that's come up that I've heard a worry about this is it not being a catch-all first or not a catch-all, but a landing place. You know what I'm saying? That so it we have some fantastic leaders in revitalization. In the conversations that I had, I get to talk to a lot of these guys and I see some guys that this is their heart, it's their passion, it's their core. The problem is a lot of the guys that are the best at this are not out in the open and aren't known.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've got four right now that come to mind, and I wish, like I told them, like I've got the ability to put a banner at the bottom of this, like a news banner of like I could scroll y'all's numbers just right across the bottom right there, and nobody would know. But honestly, a lot of the guys that are the best at this because this type of work is your nose to the grind. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? You're out there working, you're getting it done. Everybody doesn't know them.
Yeah.
And so to me, when I see this like this, uh, how do we get? I know it's a problem with denomination. Has always been this is the way we elect things. How do we prevent it from being that a holding place or a landing place or something like that, and make sure that we get those names? Do we? You hear a lot of things. How hard would it be to start bringing up names and discussing people? We've always shied away from those things,
Yeah.
but this is to me is almost a resume based. Um, got the education for it, got
Yeah.
the experience for it,
Yeah.
not the you preached a great. Don't take this wrong way on anybody. It's not because you preached a good message on this, but
Yeah.
you know what you're doing and you've got the experience and the background to do that. How in this kind of position, how do we do that the right way?
Well, I think it comes down to how mature are we? Are we grown up enough to have this conversation? And guys not see it as a political maneuver. We're so afraid of that. And of course, I grew up in a day when, you just trusted that God had a way to elevate a man where he needed to be. But I do think this is different. And I do think that guys who have been
If you don't
trained.
mind, I hate to do this. I lost signal there for about 10 seconds and I didn't
Yeah.
hear and I want to get that answer if you don't mind. If the so how do we do that? You started out with a maturity level, if you don't mind. Go ahead.
Yeah. To me, are we mature enough to have this conversation? Are we mature
Right.
enough to let a guy step up and say, I can do this. I want to do this,
Hmm.
out pointing a finger at him, say, you're just political. Uh, I think it's beyond that. I think it's bigger than that. I
Hmm.
think our system typically has been who's well known because of the camp meeting circuit, who's well known because of whatever. Of course, in this day and time, I think electronic media is
Hmm.
a highway of information rather than waiting for an annual camp meeting to see who's going to rise to the top. That takes a long time to do that.
Right.
But are we mature enough to let a guy step out and say, guys, I went to school for this, I've been trained, but more than school, more than training, here's what I've done.
Right.
I've resurrected a church with the Lord's help. I've given oversight to church planning to the tune of 10 churches on my district or 50 churches in my state. Um, I'm laying out a big open can of worms there. But I think we've got to ask that question: are we mature enough to allow a man to say, "This is my heart. I'm not being presumptuous, but if given the opportunity, I can do this." Uh, and I think you're right. If we're not careful, it will become okay. Who didn't make it to the executive committee?
Hmm.
So let's put him here. And on the flip side of that, and I wrote this in the article the other day on the Excellent Minister site, we don't need to let this become a bullpen
Right.
for the executive committee in days to come. Find the right people. Find the
Hmm.
right, and I may lose some friends over this one, but the right people may not necessarily be the best preachers.
Right.
People may not necessarily be the hot camp meeting. Everybody get him on your schedule this year,
Hmm.
or it may be. It may be because there are some men that are multi-talented, multi-gifted. I think to me a great combination for this job would be get a man at the helm that has. I mean, how honest can I be on this?
As honest as you want. This is your platform to use. Help yourself.
Get a man at the helm that can be the face of this.
Right.
He's got good leadership ability. He knows what he's doing. He will make a huge contribution to the overall leading of the department. Get him at the helm because you need his face, you need his voice, you need his drum beating. Of course, his contribution to the inner workings of it.
Hmm.
Get a man in the assistant director part of it, or vice versa. One of these positions needs to be an individual doing the grunt work,
Right.
an individual that can do the behind the scenes, put it down on paper. It's kind of like the Habakkuk principle: write the
Hmm.
vision down, make it clear, so he who reads it can run with it. To me, the dream team would be, and I have no names to call, but the dream team would be find a face, find a voice who will rally support, and then give him an individual behind him who can create the pathway, or
Hmm.
I don't like the word program, but create the pathway for this. Then what you get in 4 years, the man who's created the pathway will step into the main slot, and then just keep that cycle going. So I don't have any names to call. I don't know who they are, but I do think that would be a winning combination. A winning
Yeah, I
combination.
do too. And as we as members, so you brought up Habakkuk. I just preached this last Sunday. I'm going to encourage everybody that's watching this, give them time because we talk about Habakkuk, say, write it on the wall, take the vision, write it on the wall. But the next verse it says, but if the Lord tarries, he'll still be faithful. You know what I'm saying? That we forget that next verse sometimes. That sometimes you write the vision on the wall, God will be faithful, but it may take a minute. So let's give these guys some
Yep.
time, give them some room
Yep.
to work, give them some movement. So let me look at my notes real quick. We covered a lot of territory, and I really appreciate your openness with this. These are some good conversations. I
Sure.
do encourage some of the guys. Hey, maybe if they won't mention their own, let's start having that conversation. Let's bring some names up, put some
Yep.
resumes out. If you want to come on the podcast, come on, talk about it. I started this before I ever heard about this program. It just turned out to be the right timing to be able to talk about it. Um, I think we've covered pretty much everything else. Anything else you want to cover about the position of your heart on it?
I think it'll take care of itself. I'm sensing good momentum for it. I may be totally wrong, but I think guys see a need, and we know going in, Will, it's not going to be perfect
Hmm.
going. We'll walk away from Indianapolis without a perfect solution, but we need a solution. We need a platform. If you don't have a platform to build on, you never will build it. So I think if the guys would just get the agenda, read through the description, be willing to come to the assembly and edit it, amend it, make it what you want it to be, at least for that moment,
Mm-hmm.
and get started with it. If we don't start, we'll never get it.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much for talking about that.
Yeah.
I do want to always end on a few minutes of every guest. I love to get their perspective towards a new minister, a new guest. I do want to tell you a few quick thank yous from me as a pastor. We don't always get this opportunity to say face to face, thank you for all you have done for our movement. You have served us through some tough times. I even went back and was listening to one of your sermons one time, and you talked about how you were walking around the campus praying for some things, and you did, and like that was right before COVID, and you guided us through some things, but you mentioned the word platform.
Yeah.
And so there's two legacies I think that I don't want to boil everything you've down to, but what I see that you've done: one, we're debt free. That's awesome. That is a great thing to say at our camp, at the facilities there and everything. That was one of your visions you shared earlier, and you've been very successful at that. And you brought us into the social media world. When you came in, you started doing Just a Minute. You were posting Jeremiah Generation clips. You were out front all the time, communicating with people, been seen by people. I mentioned seeing you preach in churches. I've seen you preach in churches to 50 and then preach to thousands. And so from my heart, thank you for all that you've done. And I know you're going to be remembered for a lot more than that. But those are two things that really stand out to me. And I really want to say thank you for that. But if you don't mind, take just a few minutes, and I hope lots of young ministers will be listening to this. Take a second, give me your heart of you're going out as overseer, but you're not going anywhere. You're still going to be here, and they're still going to be able to hear you and listen to you. So give them a little bit of encouragement if you don't mind.
Well, yeah, absolutely. To me, these are the greatest days to get involved in ministry that we've ever had. The challenges are enormous, but these are the greatest days of all. I think we're right before the coming of the Lord. So I think the timing is perfect for you to get involved. Dive headlong into it, withhold nothing. Don't hold back any of yourself to the service of the Lord. Bring your family with you. Don't ever leave your family behind. Make sure your marriage is intact. Make sure at the end of the day, your sons and your daughters are with you and you're with them. God wants that for you. He doesn't want you to leave your family behind, or your marriage, or your children. So when all of this is done, do it in a way that your family will be happy to say, my dad was a pastor, my dad was a minister. And that takes a lot of discipline. That takes a lot of intentionality, but you can do it. So these are incredible days. I mean, I believe we're living in New Testament times, and these are incredible times. So give it your all. I think the key word, Will, for me is consistency. A young man came to my office one day years ago when I was a pastor, and he said, I figured out my problem. He said, my problem is I've always been real consistent at being inconsistent. Mm-hmm. So I think the key word for all of us is consistency. Consistent in our prayer life, our devotion life, consistent in our preaching. Don't follow after fads. Don't try to be somebody else. Develop your ministry. Develop your preaching style, and just stick to it. You don't have to preach like anybody you know. Just let the Lord use you, guide you, and just always be strong in content. If you go for strong content, the style will take care of itself. Mm-hmm. So these are exciting days. Pray much. All the things you expect me to say, I could say. But I'm very strong on consistency and making sure your family has enjoyed the journey with you. And remember, it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. We don't shine for a day. We want to stay in this race until it's finished. So enjoy the journey, and hopefully, I started preaching about 47 years ago, and it goes quick. And the closer to the end of it you get, the quicker it seems to go. But it's been a great journey, and I think you're going to have a great journey as well.
Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for that. As a father of two, we look after our families, and that's got to come first, man. And so that help starts at home. So thank you again for all that you've done. Thank you for being able to come here and speaking so openly about it. I think that was a really good conversation. And I know it's helped me to understand more about what our goal is with this, where we
Yep.
want to go with it. I know, like I said, put it out on the floor and hope for the best.
Yeah. I'm gonna lay it out, Will. Let's do it. Let's do it.
That's
We'll
right.
if I've got any collateral at all, I'm gonna lay it out there and say we need this. We may not get it, but we sure do need it, and I hope we will.
Hey, thank you for being willing to do that. We've got to have more of those voices. I did something not long ago with Brother Griffiths and talk about the voices of the fathers.
Yeah.
And it's important to speak out. So thank you for being willing to do that and put your voice behind it. It means a lot. So thank you again, and looking forward to seeing everything we're going to do in the future.
All right, guys. God bless.
All right. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you for watching.